The morning light filtering through the curtains did little to erase the lingering unease from the previous night. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the swirling steam. Across from her, Lucas pushed cereal around his bowl, the clinking of his spoon the only sound breaking the heavy silence. "I don't want to sleep in my room tonight," Lucas finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's heart ached at the sight of her son's tired eyes, rimmed with dark circles. "It's just a new house," she said, though her own voice lacked conviction. "It'll take some getting used to." Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at the hallway leading to the stairs. His eyes darted to the shadowed corners, and he visibly flinched when a draft caused the curtains to sway. "Mom," he said after a pause, "I think there's someone in the house." The words hung in the air, suffocating. Sarah forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "There's no one here but us, sweetheart. It's just old houses make noises." But deep down, Sarah couldn't ignore the chill creeping up her spine. The memory of the strange creak on the stairs and the fleeting sound of footsteps last night refused to leave her. After sending Lucas off to school, Sarah decided to investigate. She started with the staircase where the noises had come from. The steps looked ordinary enough, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. Kneeling down, she ran her hand along the banister, her fingers catching on something sticky. Pulling her hand back, she found a faint smear of what looked like mud. Or was it something darker? Her unease grew as she noticed faint marks on the wooden floorboards near the base of the stairs, muddy footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and they led straight to the front door. Except the door was locked from the inside. Sarah felt her breath quicken. She reached for her phone, snapping a picture of the footprints as if needing proof that she wasn't imagining things. While trying to distract herself with cleaning, Sarah's phone buzzed on the counter. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. Hesitating for a moment, she picked up. "Hello," she said cautiously. There was static on the other end, followed by a faint, raspy voice. "You need to leave." Sarah froze. "Who is this?" "You're not safe there," the voice continued, growing more urgent. "Get out before it's too late." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen, her reflection warped in the cracked glass. Who would call her with such a message? Was it a prank? Or worse, was it real? Later that day, unable to shake her growing paranoia, Sarah decided to dig into the house's history. The local library was small but packed with old records and dusty newspapers. The librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Hathaway, seemed surprised when Sarah mentioned the address. "That house?" Mrs. Hathaway asked, her brow furrowing. "It's been empty for years. You're living there now?" "Yes," Sarah replied, trying to sound casual. "Is there something I should know about it?" Mrs. Hathaway hesitated before pulling out a large, leather-bound book filled with clippings and handwritten notes. She flipped through the pages until she landed on a yellowed newspaper article. The headline sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Tragedy strikes local family. Mother and 2 children found dead in their home." Sarah's breath caught as she scanned the article. The details were sparse, but it mentioned that the family had lived in the very house she had just moved into. The mother, a widow named Margaret Holloway, was found at the bottom of the staircase, while her 2 young children were discovered in their bedrooms. The cause of death was never fully determined, though rumors swirled about foul play and the mother's mental health. "It's a sad story," Mrs. Hathaway said softly. "Margaret was a sweet woman, but after her husband died, she wasn't the same. Some say she hurt those kids herself. Others think something else happened." Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the book. She thanked Mrs. Hathaway and left the library, the weight of what she had learned pressing down on her. The Holloway family, the deaths, the staircase. It was too much of a coincidence. When Sarah returned home, the house felt colder, as if it had been holding its breath in her absence. She set her bag down on the counter, her mind racing. She needed to stay calm for Lucas's sake, but the pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in ways she didn't like. As she walked toward the stairs, her foot caught on something. Looking down, she saw one of Lucas's toys, a small action figure. lying in the middle of the hallway. She was certain it hadn't been there earlier. "Lucas," she called, even though she knew he was still at school. No response. She bent down to pick up the toy, but as her fingers brushed against it, a cold draft swept through the hallway, sending a shiver down her spine. The curtains in the living room fluttered despite the windows being shut tight. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced toward the staircase. The muddy footprints from earlier were gone. The floor was spotless, as if they had never been there. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Sarah decided to search the attic. The previous owners had left behind a few boxes, and she hoped they might hold some answers. The attic was dimly lit, the single bulb casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Sarah coughed as she pried open the first box, finding nothing but old Christmas decorations. The second box was filled with photo albums and loose photographs. Most of them were faded beyond recognition, but one caught her eye. It was a black and white portrait of a woman and two children, a boy and a girl. The woman's expression was somber, her eyes heavy with sadness. The children stood stiffly by her side, their faces eerily blank. Sarah turned the photograph over, her stomach dropping as she read the handwritten note on the back. "The Holloway family, 1978. May they find peace." Her fingers trembled as she placed the photograph back in the box. The air in the attic felt heavier now, pressing down on her chest. She needed to get out of there. As Sarah descended the attic stairs, clutching the photograph, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the somber figures from the portrait standing in the shadows. She placed the photograph on the kitchen counter, her mind racing. The house wasn't just a house. It was a graveyard for the memories of a broken family, and now those memories were seeping into her life. When Lucas came home that afternoon, Sarah hugged him tightly, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let whatever haunted this house take root in their lives. But as she held him, she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes darted toward the staircase, his small hand gripping hers a little tighter than usual. "Mom," he whispered, "she's still here." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who's still here, honey?" Lucas looked up at her, his expression filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "The girl in the white dress. She doesn't want us to leave." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in the dim, orange glow of twilight. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the counter as her mind raced. Lucas's words earlier still echoed in her ears. The girl in the white dress. She wanted to brush it off as a child's imagination, but everything that had happened so far told her otherwise. She glanced toward the living room where Lucas was curled up on the couch, clutching his favorite blanket. His eyes darted toward the staircase every so often, as though expecting something or someone to appear. Sarah knew they couldn't go on like this. The unease had seeped into every corner of the house, and it was beginning to feel suffocating. Just as Sarah decided to join Lucas in the living room, the temperature in the kitchen plummeted. Her breath misted in front of her as she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The photograph of the Holloway family still sat on the counter where she'd left it, but something was off. The faces of the children in the photo seemed different. Their expressions, once blank and somber, now held the faintest hint of a smile. A sharp knock at the window made Sarah jump. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the window was empty, just her own pale reflection staring back at her. "Mom." Lucas's voice broke through her fear. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his blanket draped over his shoulders like a cape. "Can we watch a movie? Something funny?" Sarah forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Go pick one out." As Lucas shuffled back to the living room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. She grabbed the photograph and tucked it into a drawer, as though hiding it could somehow lessen its grip on their lives. Later that evening, Sarah and Lucas sat on the couch, the flickering light of an animated comedy playing across their faces. For the first time all day, Lucas seemed relaxed, laughing at the antics on the screen. Sarah let herself breathe a little easier. Maybe things would settle down after all. But then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of the television. She froze, straining to hear. It was coming from upstairs. Her first thought was that it must be the wind, but the words were too distinct, though she couldn't make out what they were saying. She glanced at Lucas, who was still engrossed in the movie, and decided not to say anything. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like it was right at the top of the stairs. Sarah's stomach churned. She couldn't ignore it any longer. "I'll be right back, okay?" she said, brushing Lucas's hair as she stood. He barely acknowledged her, too focused on the cartoon chaos unfolding on the screen. The staircase creaked under Sarah's weight as she ascended, her steps slow and deliberate. The whispering stopped the moment she reached the top, plunging the house into an eerie silence. She turned on the hallway light, but it flickered weakly, casting more shadows than illumination. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made her skin crawl. She opened Lucas's bedroom door first, finding it just as they'd left it. His bed was neatly made, the dinosaur wallpaper looking innocent enough in the dim light. But as she stepped inside, a cold draft swept past her, making her shiver. "Who's there?" she demanded, louder this time. The closet door creaked open, just a crack. Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding. She reached out and yanked it open, only to find it empty. She laughed nervously, chastising herself for being so jumpy. But as she turned to leave, she saw it. A faint outline of a child's handprint on the window, small and smudged. It hadn't been there before. Unable to sleep, Sarah found herself pacing the house late that night. Lucas had finally gone to bed after much coaxing, but Sarah felt too restless to join him. She kept the lights on as she moved from room to room, trying to convince herself that everything was normal. She was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, when she felt it, a presence behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end as she heard the faintest sound of a giggle, like that of a young girl, echoing from the living room. Gripping the counter for support, Sarah forced herself to move. She stepped into the living room, her eyes scanning every shadow. The giggle came again, this time from the far corner of the room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The giggle turned into a sob, soft and mournful. Sarah's eyes darted to the corner where Lucas's toy chest sat. The lid was slightly ajar, and a faint glow emanated from inside. Her hands trembled as she approached, every step feeling like it took an eternity. She knelt down and lifted the lid, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, among the scattered toys, was a single item she didn't recognize. A small, porcelain doll with a cracked face and vacant eyes. Sarah picked up the doll, its weight surprisingly heavy for its size. It was old, its once white dress now yellowed with age. A chill ran through her as she turned it over, noticing a name scrawled on the back in faded ink, Lily. The doll's presence was unsettling, its lifeless gaze seeming to follow her as she carried it to the kitchen. She set it on the counter, stepping back as though it might suddenly spring to life. The whispering started again, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around her, an unintelligible chorus that made her ears ring. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness before surging back to life. And then, silence. Sarah's breath came in short gasps as she stared at the doll, which now sat slightly askew from where she'd placed it. She could have sworn she hadn't touched it. "Mom." Lucas's voice broke through the silence, startling her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, clutching his blanket. His eyes were wide with fear. "She's here," he whispered. "Who?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Lucas pointed toward the doll. "Lily. She's mad." Sarah didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the living room, the doll placed on the coffee table in front of her. Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch beside her, his small hand clutching hers. She stared at the doll, her mind racing. She needed answers. Who was Lily, and what did she want? And more importantly, how could she protect Lucas from whatever was happening? The library seemed like the best place to start. Mrs. Hathaway had mentioned that the Holloway family story was just one of many in the town's dark history. Perhaps Lily's story was hidden somewhere in the dusty archives. But as the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the doll wouldn't let her go so easily. It was more than just an object. It was a tether, a connection to something much darker. The library sat at the edge of town, a solemn, brick building that seemed untouched by time. Its arched windows reflected the morning sun, casting streaks of light onto the cobblestone path leading to the front door. Sarah pulled Lucas along, her grip firm as if letting go would mean losing him to whatever shadow loomed over them. The porcelain doll, wrapped in an old blanket, was tucked inside a tote bag hanging from her shoulder. She hated bringing it, but leaving it behind felt even worse. "Mom, why do we need to come here?" Lucas asked, his voice low and uncertain. "To find answers," Sarah replied, her tone steady though her nerves were anything but. "We need to understand what's happening." Lucas didn't ask any more questions. He simply held onto her hand tighter. Inside, the library smelled of aged paper and varnished wood. The silence was comforting yet eerie, broken only by the faint rustle of pages being turned and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Behind the front desk sat Mrs. Hathaway, her thin glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she flipped through an old ledger. She looked up and smiled warmly when she saw Sarah. "Back so soon?" she asked, her voice kind but curious. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at Lucas. "I need your help with something specific." Mrs. Hathaway's expression shifted, her curiosity deepening. "Of course. What can I do for you?" "It's about the Holloway family," Sarah said, lowering her voice. "And a girl named Lily." At the mention of Lily's name, Mrs. Hathaway stiffened ever so slightly, her smile faltering. She closed the ledger and stood, motioning for Sarah to follow. "Come with me." They were led to a small reading room at the back of the library, its walls lined with dusty tomes and faded photographs of the town's history. Mrs. Hathaway gestured for Sarah and Lucas to sit at the wooden table in the center. "What do you know about the Holloways?" Mrs. Hathaway asked, her voice quieter now. "Not much," Sarah admitted. "Just that they used to live in our house. And something terrible happened to Lily." Mrs. Hathaway nodded slowly, her eyes drifting to the tote bag slung over Sarah's chair. "And I suppose that's where the doll comes in." Sarah froze, her pulse quickening. "How did you?" "Stories have a way of finding their way back," Mrs. Hathaway said cryptically. "Let me show you something." Mrs. Hathaway disappeared into the archives and returned moments later with a slim, leather-bound journal. She placed it carefully on the table and opened it to a faded photograph of the Holloway family. The same photograph Sarah had found in the attic, but this one was clearer, less worn by time. "This journal belonged to Caroline Holloway," Mrs. Hathaway explained. "Lily's mother." Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of the page, her eyes drawn to Lily's face. The girl's expression seemed so innocent, yet now it felt like a mask hiding something deeper. "What happened to them?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hathaway sighed, folding her hands in front of her. The Holloways were a prominent family in town, known for their wealth and influence. But like many families, they had their share of troubles. Caroline was fragile, prone to bouts of paranoia and despair. After her husband died in a hunting accident, things only got worse. She paused, her gaze shifting to Lucas, who was quietly coloring in a book Sarah had brought for him. Lily was the youngest of 3 children. Her older brothers, Thomas and Edward, were much older and often away at school. She was lonely, left to wander the house and grounds on her own. Mrs. Hathaway flipped to another page in the journal, this one filled with Caroline's looping handwriting. Caroline wrote about Lily having an imaginary friend. She called it harmless at first, but over time, she began to believe it wasn't imaginary at all. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "There were incidents," Mrs. Hathaway said carefully. "Caroline wrote about hearing voices, about things moving on their own. And Lily, she changed. She became withdrawn, secretive. Caroline believed the friend was something darker." Mrs. Hathaway closed the journal and leaned back in her chair. "Then one day Lily disappeared." "Disappeared?" Sarah echoed. "She was found days later," Mrs. Hathaway said, her voice heavy, "in the woods by the creek. Her death was ruled an accident, a drowning, but Caroline never accepted that. She insisted it was the friend, that it had taken Lily." Sarah's grip on the table tightened. "And the doll?" Mrs. Hathaway's eyes flicked to the tote bag again. The doll was Lily's favorite. Caroline believed it was connected to whatever had haunted their family. After Lily's death, she tried to burn it, but it wouldn't catch fire. She threw it in the creek instead. Sarah's breath hitched. The same creek where she? Mrs. Hathaway nodded. The doll disappeared after that. Until now, it seems. Sarah's mind raced as she absorbed everything Mrs. Hathaway had said. It felt like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, but the picture they formed was still unclear and terrifying. Why is this happening now? Sarah asked, desperation creeping into her voice. Why my family? Mrs. Hathaway hesitated, her expression grave. Some things don't stay buried, Sarah. They linger, waiting for the right moment, or the right person. The weight of her words settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She glanced at Lucas, who was still blissfully unaware of the dark history surrounding them. She couldn't let this consume them. She had to find a way to stop it. Thank you, Sarah said, standing and gathering her things. For everything. Mrs. Hathaway gave her a sad smile. Be careful, Sarah. And remember, sometimes the past doesn't want to let go. As Sarah and Lucas walked back to the car, the tote bag felt heavier than ever. She placed the doll carefully on the passenger seat, its cracked face turned away from her. Lucas climbed into the back seat, clutching his blanket. Mom? He said softly as Sarah started the engine. Yes, honey? Do you think Lily's sad? Sarah's throat tightened. Why do you say that? Lucas shrugged, his gaze fixed on the doll. I think she just wants to be happy again. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She backed out of the parking lot and onto the main road, her thoughts racing. But as they drove away, a faint whisper filled the car, barely audible over the hum of the engine. It sounded like a child's voice, soft and pleading. Don't leave me. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Sarah drove back home as dusk painted the sky in a canvas of deep gray blue. The silence inside the car was only broken by the steady hum of the engine, but the unease clung to her like a thick fog. The doll sat on the passenger seat, its lifeless eyes seeming to follow her every movement. Despite her best effort to avoid looking at it, every quick glance out of the corner of her eye made her swear the expression had changed. Not just empty glass eyes, but something sharper, more knowing, yet utterly hollow. As she entered her house, Sarah was immediately struck by how heavy the air felt. The familiar comfort of home seemed to have been stripped away, leaving a sense of unfamiliarity in its place. Lucas, her young son, sat on the living room floor, quietly playing with his wooden blocks. But instead of his usual cheerful chatter, the house was eerily quiet, and his concentration seemed unnervingly intense. Lucas, honey, are you okay? Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern. Lucas didn't respond immediately. When he finally looked up at her, there was something odd in his gaze. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, She said you'd bring her back, Mommy. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Who? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lucas didn't reply. Instead, he lifted his hand and pointed toward the front door. Sarah followed his gesture to the small entry table, where she had left the doll upon entering the house. The doll remained in the same spot, but somehow, it looked different. The slightly tangled hair now appeared longer, cascading off the table in unnaturally smooth waves. She blinked hard, trying to shake off the unsettling thought that the doll was somehow alive. That night, after tucking Lucas into bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room, her laptop glowing faintly in the dim light as she searched for any records of Lily and her family. The tragedy of the drowning had been briefly covered in local newspapers, but beyond that, details were sparse. One faded article mentioned Lily's older brother, who had left the town shortly after her death under unclear circumstances. The room felt colder as Sarah scrolled through the sparse records, and a strange, prickling sensation crawled up the back of her neck. She turned, expecting to find Lucas sneaking downstairs, but the hallway behind her was empty. The light from the staircase leading to the second floor flickered faintly, though Sarah was certain she'd turned it off earlier. Reluctantly, she decided to check on Lucas, each step up the creaky stairs amplifying her unease. Lucas's door was slightly ajar. Inside, Sarah heard him whispering to someone. Pushing the door open gently, her breath caught when she saw Lucas sitting upright on his bed, facing the doll. Sarah distinctly remembered locking the doll in the living room cabinet. Yet there it was, right in front of her son, its lifeless gaze fixated on him. "Lucas, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas turned to her, his wide eyes filled with an eerie innocence. "She wants to play with me, Mommy. She says I'm her friend." Sarah grabbed Lucas and carried him downstairs, her heart pounding. She locked the doll in the cabinet again, this time making sure the latch was secure. But no matter how tightly she locked the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. She double-checked the windows, bolted the doors, and finally sat on the living room couch, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. Just as her breathing started to calm, a faint giggle echoed through the house. Her body stiffened. The sound wasn't Lucas's laugh. It was higher-pitched, childlike, but it carried an unsettling edge that made her skin crawl. The laugh came again, closer this time. From behind the sofa, Sarah whipped around, but the room was empty. The hallway light flickered once more, and then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah sat frozen as a cold breeze swept through the room, despite all the windows and doors being firmly shut. From the shadows of the hallway, a small figure began to emerge. It was a girl, no older than 7 or 8, with long dark hair and a pale, almost translucent complexion. She wore a simple white dress that looked decades old. The girl's eyes were empty yet penetrating, boring into Sarah as if trying to communicate something unspoken. "Lily?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The girl didn't speak. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the cabinet where the doll was locked away. Sarah's chest tightened as the realization dawned on her. She couldn't ignore this any longer. Whatever Lily wanted, she wasn't going to leave until Sarah faced it. Sarah slowly unlocked the cabinet, her hands trembling as she retrieved the doll. When she turned back, the girl was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. Holding the doll, Sarah felt a strange mixture of fear and sorrow. The doll no longer seemed like an ordinary toy. It was a bridge, a tether between this world and whatever lay beyond. "If you need help, Lily," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'll help you. Just show me what you need." At that moment, the house seemed to exhale. A cold gust of air rushed past her, flinging the front door open. The light bulbs overhead flickered violently, casting distorted shadows across the room. Sarah clutched the doll tightly as she realized she had made a promise she might not fully understand. The chill of the open front door seeped into Sarah's skin as she stood motionless in the middle of her living room, clutching the doll. Her heart raced as she stepped forward, peering into the dark expanse outside. The streetlights flickered faintly in the distance, casting an unnatural glow over the neighborhood. The silence was thick, almost oppressive, and it felt as if the entire world had been muted, save for the pounding of her own heart. "Lily?" Sarah called into the darkness, her voice trembling. There was no response. The night remained still, the only sound a faint rustle of leaves carried by the wind. She glanced down at the doll in her hands, its gaze fixed and unyielding, and whispered, "What do you want from me?" As if in response, the doll grew heavier in her hands, and a low, almost imperceptible hum began to resonate from within it. The sensation was subtle at first, but it intensified, vibrating through her palms and up her arms. The hum was not just a sound. It was a presence, tangible and unrelenting. Sarah's breath quickened as she realized there was no escaping this. Whatever Lily wanted, it wasn't going to stop until she found answers. With no other choice, Sarah grabbed her keys and headed out the door, the doll still clutched tightly to her chest. The drive back to the antique shop was fraught with unease. The world outside her car seemed distorted, as though the landscape had shifted subtly but undeniably. Trees loomed larger, their gnarled branches twisting unnaturally in the headlights. The road stretched endlessly, and for a moment, Sarah felt as if she were driving in circles, the same mile repeating over and over again. But then, the shop appeared, its weathered signs swinging gently in the breeze. The windows were dark, and the building looked abandoned, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Sarah parked her car and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The doll's hum had ceased, but the weight of its presence remained, pressing down on her like a physical force. The shop door was unlocked, and it creaked ominously as Sarah pushed it open. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting eerie shadows over the cluttered shelves. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and Sarah's footsteps echoed hollowly on the wooden floor. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response. She made her way to the counter, where she had first encountered the shopkeeper. The ledger from before was still open, but now it was covered in a layer of dust that hadn't been there earlier. It was as if the shop had been frozen in time, untouched since her last visit. Sarah flipped through the pages, searching for any mention of Lily or the doll. Her fingers trembled as she found an entry dated decades ago, describing the doll's origins. Acquired from the estate of the Hastings family, belonged to their youngest daughter, Lily. Death occurred under mysterious circumstances. Doll believed to hold sentimental value. Sarah's stomach twisted as she read the words. The Hastings family, Lily's family. This doll wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a connection to a tragedy that had never been resolved. As Sarah turned the page, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. She froze, her eyes darting to the doorway at the back of the shop. A figure emerged, tall and shadowed, his face obscured by the dim light. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped, and she gripped the doll tightly, ready to flee. But as the figure stepped closer, the light revealed a man in his mid-30s, his face lined with weariness and sorrow. "You're here," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I've been waiting." Sarah's grip on the doll tightened. "You're Lily's brother, aren't you?" The man nodded, his eyes scanning the doll with a mixture of fear and reverence. "I'm Thomas. I knew you'd come back. You've seen her, haven't you?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She's been following me. I don't understand what she wants." Thomas let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "She doesn't want to hurt you. She just wants to be heard. But there's more to this than you realize." He motioned for Sarah to sit, and she reluctantly complied, placing the doll on the counter between them. Thomas stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "Lily's death wasn't an accident," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "She didn't just fall into that creek. Someone pushed her." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Our father. He was a cruel man, always angry, always drunk. Lily was terrified of him. We all were. That day at the creek, they argued. I wasn't there, but I heard the stories, the whispers in town. He was the last person seen with her before it happened." Sarah felt a surge of anger and sadness as she listened to Thomas's story. Why didn't anyone do anything? Why wasn't he held accountable? Thomas shook his head. "Small towns, people don't talk. They don't want to get involved. And my father, he was powerful in his own way. People were afraid of him." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Sarah's. "Lily's been trapped ever since. She can't move on because the truth was buried with her. She's been waiting for someone to uncover it, to set her free." Sarah looked down at the doll, her heart aching. "What do I do?" Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was a picture of Lily, her smile radiant and full of life. "You have to take her back to the creek. That's where it all began, and that's where it has to end." As Sarah left the shop, the weight of Thomas's words settled heavily on her shoulders. The doll felt heavier in her arms, as if it too understood the gravity of what was to come. The road back to the creek stretched out before her, dark and foreboding. But Sarah knew there was no turning back. The journey wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about confronting the darkness that had consumed her family, about uncovering the truth and finally putting a restless soul to peace. And as Sarah drove into the night, the doll's hum began again, a low, steady vibration that seemed to guide her forward.